This is the Middle East. And just in case you didn't know already, this is current-day Palestine. And this is the hotly contested Israel. And in this video, we're going to focus primarily on this area. But unlike the rest of the internet, this video is not about the history of the Palestinian Israeli conflict. It is not a video about how Israel came into existence, nor a video discussing what happened in the most recent tragic attacks. And most importantly, this is not a propaganda video. There's already hundreds of those online. Rather, our goal in this video is quite simple. We're going to answer three important questions. 1. Why does the US so strongly support its ally Israel? 2. Who is really to blame for the Palestinian Israeli conflict? And finally 3. What should us Muslims do to help this situation? Question number 1. Why does the US so strongly support its ally Israel? First of all, there's no sole answer to this question. When you think of why the US supports Israel, you have to think of a pie chart with at least 3 parts. And we're going to start with the smallest section first, meaning the least important to the most important reason. Here, we have the Jewish-Israeli lobby, aka AIPAC. At first glance, you might be someone who says our pie chart is wrong. This should be the biggest piece because the Jewish-Israeli lobby is so powerful. Well, you'd be mistaken. This is one of the many narratives that Israel promotes, and this is normal. All countries today use their media power to promote what they want the world to see, whether it's true or not, and of course Israel does this too. The best example of this is the Israeli narrative that if you criticize Israel, then you must be anti-Semitic, meaning you are just prejudiced against the Jewish people or the Jewish religion. Of course, this narrative they promote is absurd. Imagine applying this same logic to the corrupt, warmongering monarchy of Saudi Arabia, whose population is Muslim and whose leaders are technically Muslim. So if we criticize Saudi Arabian policies, does that mean somehow we are anti-Muslim or Islamophobic? Of course not. Again, this logic is absurd. And the power of AIPAC falls under this type of fiction. But like most things in life, if you actually follow the money, you will see that the Jewish-Israeli lobby is not really that strong at all. Because remember, when it comes to lobbying politicians in the United States, money is power and influence. For example, in 2020, during an election year, the biggest and strongest lobbyists were these guys: the pharmaceutical companies, electronic manufacturers, defense contractors, oil companies, etc., who spent multiple millions of dollars on lobbying, while AIPAC only spent $3.7 million. Now, of course, AIPAC does yield some influence over Congress, but as you can see, it is just a drop in the lobbying bucket, and that is why it's just a small piece of the pie chart. Which brings us over to this part. We call this section the last political safe haven. To understand what we mean by this statement, you must understand what the Middle East means to the world, and nothing describes it better than this statement. In 1944, the US State Department described the Arabian Peninsula as constituting, quote, a stupendous source of strategic power and the greatest material prize in the world's history, end quote. Now, why would the US State Department back then say such a bold statement? Well, that's simple. The Middle East has an abundance of raw resources, in particular oil, and the Middle East has some of the world's most strategically important shipping lanes. And quite simply, whomever controls this area yields tremendous influence and power over the world. But we Muslims all know too well that the Middle East does have a big problem, namely our borders. Remember, after the Ottomans were defeated in World War I, the destructive British policy of divide and conquer carved up the Middle East to look like this. And of course, we know these borders were not created for peace and stability. Rather, they were purposely created so this area is in a constant state of chaos. The British Empire did this in many parts of the world on purpose, so they will always have an excuse to interfere due to the manufactured chaos. But the problem with this type of artificially border-induced chaos is sometimes it can get out of hand, as we witnessed during the Arab Spring. In other words, because each of these countries always has the potential to turn on a dime, and as a result, the potential loss of influence and power in this part of the world is always there too. This actually explains why, from the US's perspective, Israel is so important to the US's geopolitical interests. Think about it. Israel is a country in the heart of the Middle East, right off the coast of the Mediterranean. It is a country that shares US core values of democracy and replacement settler colonialism. And most importantly, in a sea of potentially chaotic borders, Israel represents a safe, stable ally in the Middle East. In other words, in the event that the other Arab state allies fail US strategic interests or get overthrown, Israel will always represent the last political safe haven that the US can yield its influence over the Middle East out of. And that's why without America, Israel doesn't exist. It's just like Joe Biden said many years ago when describing US interests in the Middle East. In particular, he was describing US's key support for Israel.
I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
Which now brings us to the biggest reason the US supports Israel, and it has to do with this. This amazing map, put together by shipmap.org, is a real-time map of the world's global economy via ocean shipping. It is quite astonishing how interconnected the world currently is. And when you look at this map, there are 7 areas of great importance called choke points that all these ships must pass through in order to make this all work. Which means, if you're a country or a superpower like the United States, and you want to yield tremendous influence and power over the global economy, then you must control these choke points. And one of these important choke points is here. This is the Suez Canal, a 120-mile strip of water where 12% of the world's economy passes through, including oil and natural gas. In other words, an especially important geopolitical choke point. Now technically, due to fracking, the US doesn't need the Suez Canal, or the Middle East for that matter, for its shipping and oil needs. However, the rest of the world does, like Europe and China. And that is what we mean by influence and power. The Suez Canal was originally designed, created, and controlled by the French in 1859. But by 1882, the British managed to take control of the canal and held onto it until the mid-1950s. But with the help of Israel and the CIA in Egypt via Jamal Abdel Nasser, since 1975, it is the US that yields sole control and influence over this important choke point. Now technically, Egypt oversees administrating the Suez Canal, which is why the US provides $1.4 billion in military aid to the Egyptian junta. But do you really think that the United States is going to allow the undemocratic and potentially unstable military dictatorship of Egypt to manage the Suez Canal with no checks and balances? No. That is why the US sends over double of what it sends to Egypt to Israel, $3.3 billion in military aid. And why it is an Israeli company called Seagull that provides the security for the Suez Canal. It is also why Israel is allowed to purchase the most advanced weapons, so it will always have the checks and balances edge over the rest of its neighbors, especially Egypt. It is actually quite an ingenious setup. The US has one ally in Israel watching over another ally in Egypt to help maintain the geopolitical dominance over the canal. Very clever. The bottom line is, when you have a system like this, and a large portion of this system that has money and control and economics and energy runs through a choke point in that system, there will always be a geostrategic value put on that choke point for power and influence. And Israel is an important piece and a general contractor overseeing other subcontractors in maintaining that power and influence for the United States. Question number 2. Who is really to blame for the Palestinian Israeli conflict? This question is actually the easiest to answer. No fancy pie chart needed here. Who's to blame? These men. These men are the former and current rulers of the Middle East and the greater area. And unlike the Palestinians, these men actually have a country. Countries with their own resources, their own institutions, and most importantly, their own armies. And despite having all this at their disposal, these men have done nothing of substance to actually put an end to the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. Yes, they sometimes give the Palestinians lip service in the media, or send them money/donations, or sometimes they send over bottle rockets they call weapons, but again, nothing of real substance. And to make it worse, these people in power actually use the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for their own benefit. For example, the Assad clan has been using the boogeyman of Israel to impose their tyrannical rule over their people for decades. Turkey's President Erdogan expels the Israeli ambassador every time he needs to shore up his pan-Islamic credentials within his voting bloc. And before the 2020 Abraham Accords were signed, the majority of these cronies were quick to publicly denounce Israel and blame them for pretty much everything wrong in the world today. But for years, they've had secret back-channel dealings with Israel to buy weapons and digital surveillance tools to use on their own citizens. The main point here is that we Muslims should memorize their corrupt faces and teach our children the truth. These people, these men, these political animals do not care about Islam. They don't even care about their own citizens. And of course, they don't care about the Palestinians. All they really care about, and actively put all their energy and resources behind, is making sure they stay in power and get very rich in the process. In other words, all they care about is their chairs. It really is a modern day Game of Thrones at the expense of Muslim blood, even if that blood is spilled in Palestine. Which brings us to the last and final question. What are some things Muslims can or should do to help the situation? This question, unfortunately, is insanely difficult and complex to answer because the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim world today is not in a good place. We are intellectually and politically fractured, which is why we have crises everywhere, like Yemen, like Myanmar, like Syria, like China, like Palestine. That's what happens when we Muslims are scattered, atomized, and have no central government of our own to defend us regardless of where we were born. But at a very minimum, how about we start with a very small baby step in the right direction? Let's start with these. Ever wonder why all these flags look the same? The same basic colors and overall recycled design? It is because these flags were imposed on us by the British. Back when the Arabs helped revolt, quote unquote, and defeat the last remaining Islamic government. Quite a sad day in our history, actually. And today, these flags no longer represent revolt, as bad as that was. Now it's far worse. These flags symbolize Muslim division and disunity, yet are somehow held up as defiance to colonialism. Imagine you live here, and because of this imaginary line and these made-up flags, these two people who used to be good neighbors 100 years ago now despise each other. Although they are both Muslim, it no longer matters. The Islamic bond has been replaced by these flags. These flags also represent these guys. Whether you are conscious of this or not, these flags are a symbolic representation of each of these corrupt Western-backed regimes. So every time Muslims or Arabs protest or march against our suffering, like here, or here, or here, these guys love it. Because using their flags just reinforces this nationalistic division and system of control over us. And remember, since the Arab Spring, these political animals have regrouped and solidified their grip on power. And they learned that they no longer have to throw fake support to the Palestinian cause just to distract us from their corruption. All they have to do now is just inject the public discourse with more and more nationalism. Call to action. How about we start with one simple and important baby step? Let's start by ditching these flags and all they represent right into the garbage. If it's hanging from your car, throw it out. If it's displayed in your house or your business, toss it. Think about it. If you are one of these corrupt leaders and the Muslims worldwide are protesting against you without using one of their flags, that's a very powerful baby step. The bottom line is, we have to start to sever the connection between us and these rulers. And once this connection is severed, then and only then can the real work to solve the Palestinian Israeli conflict begin to start. That's all for now. Please subscribe to get notifications of future videos, and please feel free to leave a comment below if you'd like. Thanks for watching. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.